Let me tell you about the day my life turned upside down. All because of a truck, a rule I didn't know existed, and one very entitled HOA representative. It started like any other Saturday morning. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and I had plans to spend the day tinkering with my old pickup truck. That truck wasn't just a vehicle, it was part of my identity. It carried me through road trips, helped me move apartments, and even hauled furniture for friends when they needed help. Sure, it wasn't shiny or new, but it had character, and it worked. When I stepped outside that morning, coffee in hand, I froze. My driveway was empty. At first, I thought I might have parked it somewhere else by mistake. Maybe I left it at the grocery store, or perhaps I'd forgotten to pull it back into the driveway after washing it last night. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. My gut told me this wasn't an accident. And then I saw it, a white piece of paper taped to my front door. My heart sank as I peeled it off and read the words scrawled across it. Asterisk, your vehicle has been towed due to violation of Section 4.7c of the Harmony Estates Covenants. Gasoline-powered vehicles are prohibited within community limits. Please contact us for further instructions. Asterisk. I blinked at the note, reading it again and again. Gasoline-powered vehicles. Prohibited. This had to be some kind of prank. Who bans gas cars from a neighborhood? And why hadn't anyone told me about this before now? I bought this house 6 months ago, and not once, did anyone mention anything about banning certain types of vehicles. If they had, I would have thought twice about moving here. Fuming, I grabbed my phone and dialed the number listed on the notice. A woman answered after a few rings. Her voice was sugary sweet, almost fake, like she was putting on a performance. Thank you for calling Harmony Estates Homeowners Association. This is Karen speaking. How may I assist you today? Karen, I said, trying to keep my tone calm despite the storm brewing inside me. My truck has been towed. Can you explain what's going on? Why is there a rule against gasoline-powered vehicles? Oh yes, she replied smoothly, clearly unfazed by my frustration. We've implemented eco-friendly guidelines to ensure our community remains sustainable. Gasoline vehicles harm the environment, so we've banned them within our boundaries. Eco-friendly guidelines. Sustainable. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sure, protecting the environment is important, but towing someone's car without warning felt extreme, especially since I had no idea such a rule existed. Well, why didn't anyone tell me about this when I moved in? I asked, gripping the phone tighter. I never received any notices or emails about these rules. There was a pause on her end, followed by a colder, more condescending tone. Mr. Name, she said, emphasizing my name like it was a lecture, it's your responsibility to familiarize yourself with the covenants. Ignorance doesn't excuse non-compliance. Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. Responsibility. How was I supposed to follow rules I didn't even know about? This whole situation felt unfair, and Karen's attitude only made it worse. She sounded like she enjoyed enforcing these ridiculous policies, like she got some kind of twisted satisfaction from punishing people who didn't toe the line. As I hung up the phone, anger bubbled inside me. This wasn't just about my truck anymore. It was about principle. Who did Karen think she was, waltzing into people's lives and taking away their property over something as petty as a parking rule? I decided right then and there that I wasn't going to let her win. Not without a fight. After that infuriating phone call with Karen, I knew I couldn't just sit back and let this slide. Something about her tone, the way she dismissed my concerns so casually, made me want to dig deeper. If the HOA had rules this extreme, surely they were written down somewhere. And if they were written down, I needed to find them. I stormed into the house, grabbed the thick HOA handbook I'd shoved into a drawer months ago, and started flipping through it. The pages were filled with tiny text, endless sections, and clauses that seemed designed to confuse anyone who tried to read them. But after a few minutes of searching, I found it. Section 4.7c. There it was in black and white. All residents must operate zero-emission vehicles within community boundaries. Below that, in even smaller print, was a line that said, "Failure to comply will result in immediate removal of offending vehicles at owner's expense." Zero-emission vehicles. Immediate removal. It sounded like something out of a sci-fi movie where robots enforced environmental laws. How could they expect everyone in the neighborhood to own electric or hybrid cars? Not everyone could afford that kind of upgrade. My truck might not be fancy, but it gets the job done. And now it was gone because of some ridiculous rule I didn't even know existed. But then I noticed something else buried in the fine print, a clause about exceptions. It mentioned legacy vehicles, which were defined as cars manufactured before 1980. Apparently, these older vehicles could stay if approved by the HOA board. Legacy vehicles. Was my beat-up Ford F-150 considered legacy? Probably not. It was only 15 years old, but it gave me an idea. Maybe I could argue for an exception based on this loophole. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. This wasn't just about my truck anymore. It was about fairness. If the HOA wanted to enforce such strict rules, shouldn't they have made sure everyone knew about them? Why hadn't I received any emails, letters, or warnings? They couldn't just spring this on people without giving them a chance to adapt. Determined to fight back, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. I figured if I showed up and explained my situation, maybe they'd see reason. After all, I wasn't asking for special treatment. I just wanted my truck back. So I emailed the HOA secretary, not Karen, thank goodness, and requested to speak during the upcoming meeting. She replied with a curt confirmation, reminding me to keep my comments brief and respectful. Brief and respectful? Sure, I thought. Let's see how long that lasts once I'm face to face with Karen. On the day of the meeting, I arrived early, clutching copies of the handbook and notes I prepared. The community center was already filling up with neighbors I barely recognized. Some nodded politely as I walked in, while others avoided eye contact altogether. At the front of the room sat Karen, looking every bit as smug as she had sounded on the phone. She wore a perfectly pressed blazer and held a clipboard like it was a weapon. Beside her was Mr. Grayson, the HOA president, who seemed far less intimidating but equally unreadable. When it was finally my turn to speak, I stood up and took a deep breath. All eyes were on me, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "Hi," I began, trying to sound calm despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "I'm here because my truck was towed last week under Section 4.7c of the Covenants. I'm appealing this decision based on 2 points. First, I was never informed of this rule prior to purchasing my home. And second, I believe my vehicle qualifies for an exception under the legacy clause." Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Mr. Name," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "the legacy clause applies only to vehicles manufactured before 1980. Your truck does not qualify." Her response caught me off guard, but I refused to back down. "That's true. But nowhere in the handbook does it say exceptions can't be granted for other circumstances. I've lived here for 6 months without issue, and suddenly my truck is banned. Without warning? That doesn't seem fair." The room grew tense. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others whispered to each other. Karen glanced at Grayson, who remained silent, letting her handle the situation. For a moment, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. This wasn't just about getting my truck back anymore. It was about standing up for myself against a system that felt rigged from the start. As I stood there in front of the HOA board, staring down Karen and her clipboard of doom, I realized something important. I wasn't alone. The room was filled with neighbors, people who lived in the same community as me. And while most of them weren't saying anything, their body language told a story. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats or avoiding eye contact. Others exchanged glances like they were silently debating whether to speak up. It was clear that not everyone in Harmony Estates was on Karen's side. Karen, however, didn't seem fazed by my argument, or the growing tension in the room. She leaned forward slightly, her expression cool and collected, as if she'd dealt with situations like this 100 times before. "Mr. Name," she said, her voice steady but laced with superiority. "Rules are put in place for the benefit of the entire community. If we allowed exceptions every time someone claimed ignorance, there would be no order here at all." Her words stung, partly because they sounded so rehearsed, and partly because she made it sound like I was some kind of troublemaker trying to disrupt the peace. But I wasn't asking for chaos. I was asking for fairness. How could anyone follow rules they didn't even know existed? Still, I bit my tongue and tried to stay calm. Losing my temper wouldn't help me win this fight. Before I could respond, an older man sitting near the back of the room cleared his throat loudly. Everyone turned to look at him, including Karen, whose smile faltered ever so slightly. The man stood up slowly, using his cane for support, and shuffled toward the front of the room. He introduced himself as Joe, a neighbor who lived 2 doors down from me. "Come on, Karen," Joe said gruffly, his voice carrying a mix of frustration and authority. "This is ridiculous. The guy didn't know about the rule because nobody tells us anything unless we dig through that massive handbook ourselves. Give him a break." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Someone was actually sticking up for me. And it wasn't just Joe. One by one, other neighbors began chiming in. A woman named Linda spoke next, her tone firm but polite. "My son had his motorcycle towed last month because it was parked in our garage. Our garage Karen. Since when do we micromanage where people park their vehicles?" Another neighbor added, "And what about communication? When I moved in, I didn't get any orientation or briefing about these so-called eco-friendly guidelines. We shouldn't have to sift through fine print to figure out what's allowed." The room erupted into murmurs of agreement. People shared stories of similar frustrations, vehicles being towed without warning, confusing rules enforced inconsistently, and a general lack of transparency from the HOA. It was like opening a floodgate. Once one person started talking, others followed suit. Karen's confident demeanor began to crack under the pressure. She glanced nervously at Mr. Grayson, the HOA president, who had remained eerily quiet throughout the discussion. For the first time since I'd met her, she seemed unsure of herself. Her earlier smugness was replaced by a flicker of doubt, though she tried hard to mask it. Grayson finally spoke up, raising a hand to quiet the crowd. All right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's take a step back and address the concerns raised here today. Clearly, there's been some miscommunication, and perhaps we need to revisit how we enforce certain policies." His words felt like a small victory, but I knew the battle wasn't over yet. Karen might have lost this round, but she wasn't the type to give up easily. Still, I couldn't help feeling a spark of hope. For the first time since moving into Harmony Estates, I felt like part of a real community, a group of people willing to stand up for each other, even against the iron grip of the HOA. As the meeting continued, I sat back down, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe this was the start of something bigger. Maybe we could push for change, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against Karen and her rules. The room was buzzing now, a mix of frustration and determination filling the air. It felt like the tide was turning. People were finally speaking up, and Karen's usual armor of authority was starting to show cracks. But just when I thought things might spiral completely out of her control, Mr. Grayson stepped in again, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a knife. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," he said firmly, though his tone was calmer than Karen's had been. "We understand there are concerns about communication and enforcement, but we also have a responsibility to uphold the standards that make Harmony Estates, well, harmonious." I rolled my eyes at that last word. Harmonious. Was towing someone's truck without warning really creating harmony? Still, I kept quiet, letting him continue. He glanced around the room, making brief eye contact with a few neighbors before turning his attention back to me. "Mr. Name," he began, leaning forward slightly as if to appear more approachable, "we appreciate your willingness to engage constructively. However, rules exist for a reason. Allowing gasoline-powered vehicles undermines our commitment to sustainability, a value shared by many residents here." His words hit a nerve. Sustainability was one thing, but enforcing it this way felt extreme. Before I could respond, Joe, the older man with the cane, spoke up again. "Sustainability is great, Grayson, but let's be honest. This isn't just about saving the planet. It's about control. You can't dictate every little thing people do, especially when they don't even know the rules." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Even Linda nodded emphatically, crossing her arms over her chest. For a moment, it seemed like Grayson might lose control of the meeting entirely. But then he did something unexpected. He smiled. Not Karen's smug grin, but an actual, genuine smile. "You're right, Joe," he admitted, surprising everyone, including me. "Communication has been an issue, and perhaps we've been too rigid in some areas. That's why I propose a compromise." He paused, letting the tension build before continuing. "If Mr. Name agrees to transition to an electric or hybrid vehicle within 6 months, we'll waive the towing fees and return his truck immediately." The room fell silent. 6 months. Transitioning to a new vehicle wasn't exactly easy or cheap, but it was better than nothing. I hesitated, weighing my options. On one hand, I hated the idea of giving in to their demands. On the other hand, fighting indefinitely would only drag this out, and I needed my truck back. Plus, if I pushed too hard, they might dig their heels in further. Finally, I nodded. "All right," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But I want this agreement documented in writing. And moving forward, I expect clearer communication about these rules, not just for me, but for everyone." Grayson nodded approvingly. "Fair enough. We'll draft a formal letter outlining the terms and ensure all residents receive updated guidelines within the next week." Karen looked furious, her lips pressed into a thin line as she scribbled furiously on her clipboard. Clearly, she hadn't expected Grayson to take such a moderate stance. Part of me wondered if she'd try to find another way to make my life difficult later, but for now, I didn't care. I'd taken a stand, and it had paid off, at least partially. As the meeting wrapped up, several neighbors approached me to offer support. One woman handed me her number, saying, "If you need help navigating the HOA nonsense, call me. We should stick together on this." Another man simply patted my shoulder and said, "Good job standing up to them." Walking out of the community center that evening, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, because I'd gotten closer to getting my truck back. Frustration, because the whole ordeal shouldn't have happened in the first place. And hope that maybe, just maybe, this moment marked the beginning of change in Harmony Estates. Still, as I climbed into my borrowed car, a kind neighbor had offered theirs until my truck was returned. I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done with me yet. The days following the HOA meeting felt like a roller coaster, one of those old rickety ones where you're not sure if it's going to hold together. On paper, things seemed okay. Grayson had promised my truck would be returned within 48 hours, and true to his word, it reappeared in my driveway 2 mornings later, dusty but intact. I was relieved, of course, but that relief came with a side of unease. Something about the whole situation still didn't sit right. Karen, predictably, wasn't happy about the compromise. She avoided me whenever we crossed paths, which happened more often than I liked since she seemed to always be inspecting the neighborhood. Every time I saw her walking down the street with her clipboard, jotting down notes like some kind of suburban detective, I couldn't help but feel like she was waiting for me to slip up again. It was exhausting, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering what rule I might accidentally break next. But it wasn't just Karen who made me uneasy. The HOA's updated guidelines arrived in everyone's mailboxes a few days after the meeting, and while they were clearer than before, they also revealed just how much control the board wanted over our lives. There were rules about everything: how often lawns needed mowing, what color curtains could hang in front-facing windows, even restrictions on hosting gatherings that lasted longer than 3 hours. Reading through them felt suffocating, like living here required trading freedom for perfection. Despite all this, I wasn't ready to give up. The support from my neighbors during the meeting gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, people were starting to realize how unreasonable the HOA had become. A small group of us began meeting informally at Joe's house every Wednesday evening to discuss ways we could push back against their strict policies. At first, it was just venting, a chance to share frustrations and laugh about Karen's latest antics. But soon, the conversations turned into something more serious. "We need transparency," Linda said one night, pacing in Joe's living room. "They can't keep springing these rules on us without warning. We should demand regular updates, maybe even quarterly meetings where residents have a real say in decisions." Joe nodded thoughtfully, tapping his cane against the floor. "And accountability," he added. "Right now, Karen runs this place like it's her personal kingdom. If we can get Grayson on board, maybe we can create a system where complaints are handled fairly instead of being dismissed outright." Their ideas energized me, but they also scared me a little. Taking on the HOA meant risking backlash, especially from someone like Karen, who thrived on power trips. Still, I knew I couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just about my truck anymore. It was about standing up for ourselves as a community. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, I noticed a familiar figure walking toward me. It was Mr. Grayson. He stopped at the edge of my driveway, hands tucked into his pockets, looking unusually hesitant. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the steps. I hesitated, unsure of his intentions, but finally nodded. "Thanks," he said, sitting down beside me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed and looked out at the quiet street. "I know you're frustrated," he began, his voice softer than usual. "And honestly, so am I. Running this HOA isn't easy, especially when people feel like they don't have a voice. But change takes time, and pushing too hard, too fast, might do more harm than good." I studied him carefully, trying to gauge whether he was being genuine or just trying to smooth things over. "Change is necessary," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "People aren't asking for chaos. They're asking for fairness." Grayson nodded slowly. "Fair point. And I'll admit, Karen's methods leave something to be desired. But she does care about the community, even if she goes about it the wrong way sometimes." His defense of her surprised me, though I didn't argue. Instead, I changed the subject slightly. What happens if nothing changes? If people keep feeling ignored, sooner or later, they'll stop caring altogether. He didn't answer right away, but the look on his face told me he understood exactly what I meant. As he stood to leave, he gave me a small nod. "Just remember, progress is possible if we work together." That night, as I lay in bed replaying the conversation in my head, I realized something important. Fighting the HOA wasn't going to be easy. But with persistence and unity, it might actually lead somewhere. The weeks that followed were a mix of small victories and lingering tension. The informal meetings at Joe's house became a regular thing, and slowly but surely, more neighbors started showing up. At first, it was just a handful of us: me, Joe, Linda, and a few others who had been directly affected by the HOA's strict rules. But as word spread, the group grew. People brought snacks, coffee, and ideas, turning what had started as a venting session into something resembling a grassroots movement. One evening, as we gathered around Joe's dining table cluttered with papers and empty cups, Linda raised an important question. "How do we make sure this isn't just talk? We need action, a plan to hold the HOA accountable." Her words hit home. Up until now, we'd mostly been sharing stories and brainstorming ways to improve communication with the board. But if we wanted real change, we needed to take concrete steps. After some discussion, we decided on two things. First, we'd draft a petition demanding clearer guidelines and more transparency from the HOA. Second, we'd request a special meeting with Grayson and the rest of the board to present our concerns directly. Drafting the petition turned out to be harder than expected. Everyone had different priorities. Some people cared most about vehicle restrictions, while others were frustrated by lawn maintenance schedules or noise ordinances. But after hours of debate and plenty of coffee refills, we managed to create a unified list of demands. The key message was simple: residents deserved fair treatment and clear communication. When the petition was ready, we spent days going door to door, explaining our goals and encouraging neighbors to sign. To my surprise, many people were eager to support us. Some admitted they'd been too intimidated to speak up before. Others confessed they hadn't realized how widespread the frustration was. By the time we submitted the petition to the HOA office, with nearly 70% of households signed on, it felt like we were finally making progress. The special meeting came a week later. This time, the community center was packed, not just with board members, but with residents ready to voice their opinions. Karen looked visibly uncomfortable as she scanned the room, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. Grayson, on the other hand, seemed almost relieved to see so many people engage. Maybe he really did want change, even if his methods weren't always perfect. Linda took the lead during the meeting, presenting the petition and outlining our requests. Her calm yet firm tone commanded attention. And for once, Karen didn't interrupt. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before Grayson spoke. "I appreciate the effort you've all put into this," he said, glancing at the stack of signatures. "And I agree, communication has been lacking. Moving forward, we'll implement monthly newsletters to keep everyone informed about rule changes and upcoming decisions." It wasn't everything we asked for, but it was a start. Still, Karen couldn't resist chiming in. "That said," she added sharply, "rules are still rules. Just because we're improving communication doesn't mean exceptions will be handed out freely." Her comment drew murmurs of disapproval from the crowd, but instead of arguing, Joe stood up. "Fair enough," he said, his gravelly voice cutting through the noise. "But let's remember why these rules exist: to benefit the community. If they're causing more harm than good, maybe it's time to rethink them." The meeting ended without any dramatic resolutions, but as we filed out of the room, I noticed something encouraging. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before were exchanging smiles and phone numbers. There was a sense of solidarity in the air, a feeling that we weren't alone in this fight. Later that night, as I sat on my porch watching the stars, I reflected on how far we'd come. Sure, the battle wasn't over. Karen would likely find new ways to test our patience, but for the first time since moving to Harmony Estates, I felt hopeful. Change might be slow, but it was possible. And sometimes, standing together made all the difference. Months passed, and life in Harmony Estates began to shift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but then more noticeably. The HOA's monthly newsletters started showing up in everyone's mailboxes, just as Grayson had promised. They weren't perfect. They still read like legal documents half the time, but they were better than nothing. For once, we knew what was happening before it happened, instead of finding out through a terse note taped to our doors. Karen, predictably, didn't take kindly to the changes. She seemed to grow quieter during meetings, her usual sharp comments replaced by tight-lipped nods. But I couldn't help noticing how often she lingered after the sessions ended, whispering urgently with Grayson or scribbling notes that no one else could see. It was clear she wasn't ready to give up her control without a fight. Still, there were moments when even Karen seemed human. One afternoon, I ran into her at the local grocery store. She was standing in the checkout line, holding a box of cookies and looking oddly vulnerable without her clipboard armor. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to say something. but eventually decided on a polite hi. To my surprise, she responded with an equally awkward smile. "Hello," she said stiffly, glancing down at the cookies in her hands. "These are for a neighbor." I nodded, resisting the urge to laugh. "That's nice of you." She shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to end the conversation, but then added, almost reluctantly, "Look, I know things have been tense lately, but I'm trying, okay?" Her words caught me off guard. Was this Karen, the same woman who had towed my truck and dismissed my concerns with a wave of her hand, actually apologizing? Well, sort of apologizing. I didn't push it. Instead, I gave her a small nod. "I appreciate that." After that brief exchange, things between us remained civil, if not exactly friendly. She still inspected the neighborhood with her clipboard, and I still rolled my eyes whenever I saw her coming. But the edge was gone. Maybe she realized she couldn't keep fighting all of us forever. As for me, I learned a lot from the whole ordeal. Standing up to the HOA wasn't easy. It required patience, persistence, and a willingness to work with others. But it taught me the power of community. Before this, I'd been content to keep to myself, avoiding conflict and hoping my neighbors would do the same. But now I knew their names, their stories, and their frustrations. Joe became a mentor of sorts, always ready with advice or a listening ear. Linda introduced me to her family, including her teenage son, whose motorcycle saga had sparked so much outrage at the meeting. Even the quieter neighbors, like the elderly couple across the street, would wave hello and ask how I was doing. The truck incident also made me reflect on my own role in the community. At first, I'd seen myself as an outsider, a victim of unfair rules imposed by people who didn't understand me. But over time, I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for everyone who felt powerless against the HOA's rigid standards. That realization changed the way I approached problems, not just here, but in other areas of my life too. By the 6-month mark, I'd managed to save enough money to start looking into hybrid trucks. It wasn't ideal. I still loved my old Ford, but it felt like a compromise worth making. When I finally drove my new vehicle home, I parked it proudly in the driveway and took a step back to admire it. Sure, it wasn't the same as my trusty pickup, but it was a symbol of progress, not just for me, but for the neighborhood as a whole. That evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, I thought about how far we'd come. Harmony Estates wasn't perfect. It probably never would be, but it was getting better. And sometimes, that's all you can ask for.